Hello cinephiles! Aside from the brilliant performance of Daniel Day-Lewis as oilman Daniel Plainview, Paul Thomas Anderson's 2007 film There Will Be Blood is perhaps best known for its beautiful naturalistic cinematography, which was nominated for over 20 different awards, including a win for Best Achievement in Cinematography at the Academy Awards. So how did they do it? Today we'll take a look at what cameras, lenses, and film stock they used, as well as the real locations, naturalistic lighting, and how they got some of the tricky shots. This is Making Film. Paul Thomas Anderson hired his main man, Robert Elswit, to do the cinematography on There Will Be Blood. Elswit had previously shot all of PTA's movies up to that point: Hard 8, aka Sydney, Boogie Nights, Magnolia, and Punch Drunk Love. Elswit came to Anderson's attention after he saw Elswit's cinematography work on 1992's Waterland. The two were later introduced by a mutual acquaintance, John C. Reilly, who would star in Anderson's first movie, Hard 8.
What do you squat?
Not 2.
Super.
Elswit said, "Paul is 20 years younger than me, but I liked him right away. He had so much energy and enthusiasm. He also loved some of the same movies I love, particularly films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, many of which are somewhat obscure. Even at 25, Paul was an encyclopedia of American film, and he was very aware of what pictorial style meant. He can respond immediately to something he sees and understand instinctively why it works or why it doesn't." Anderson said that he will speak with Elswit from time to time to let him know what he's working on before the script is finished, and Elswit, who is often very busy working on other films, will kind of hang back and say that whatever it is sounds good. Anderson said, "Robert lingers on the edges through pre-production, never really saying much because he knows once we start shooting, it's him front and center. He has a great way of staying back and letting everybody do their work and not jamming his opinion down anybody's throat. He's the master of not peaking early. He's done so many films he knows just how to pace himself. He lingers, lets things settle and hears everybody out, and then comes in and cleans it all up and makes it happen. When Elswit's time comes during pre-production, he and Anderson will go to the sets and walk things through to figure out what the possibilities are. They'll catch up and mess around with lenses and stuff, but their main focus is to plan the shooting schedule, which takes about 1 or 2 days. They don't storyboard shots, but I believe they actually did storyboard the oil fire scene, but we'll talk about that in another video. As many are aware, one of the biggest inspirations for There Will Be Blood was John Huston's 1948 film, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. This is a favorite of Anderson's, but the inspiration is not only in theme, but in the style as well, mainly its simplicity. Anderson said, "On this film we were trying to keep things simple, the simplest kinds of frames, the simplest number of shots, and we tried to follow the influence of filmmakers like Huston. The movies of the 40s are incredibly straightforward. They're the ones I love the most, really." As strange as it sounds, simplicity can often be a difficult mindset to stay in. One day, Anderson convinced producer Daniel Lupi to get a crane that he was adamant that he would use. But once they got the camera attached and everything was ready to go, they thought it looked terrible and out of place. Anderson said, "It wasn't the crane's fault, it was just that we didn't need it." As interesting as the camera work is, the style of There Will Be Blood is very stripped down, and it almost looks as if it was made with a skeleton crew. I can't really imagine 100 crew members behind the camera during this shot. Here's a photo of them getting the shot. It would just be so out of place to mix in a lavish Sergio Leone-style crane shot. They also shot this part at magic hour, which refers to the short amount of time after sunrise or before sunset where the light is softer and has a beautiful orange glow. They also shot it with a Steadicam in order to give the scene a, quote, floating feel. Anderson wanted the camera work to have its own personality that felt real and imperfect. A good example of this is the dolly shot of the car driving up to town. Elswit said, "My dolly grip, Jeff Kunkel, was ready to attach the camera to a stabilized head, but I knew Paul would never go for that. Instead, we had the camera on a dolly with nobody sitting on it, and it was pushed down the track as fast as it would go. I had Hot Wheels at the end of the track waiting for it. See how the shot shakes and wobbles much like the car shakes and wobbles on the dirt road." There Will Be Blood was shot on Panaflex Platinum, Millennium XL, and Panavision C-Series and E-Series 35mm cameras with high-speed anamorphic lenses. Anamorphic lenses film a stretched-out image, in this case onto 35mm film, and then the image is corrected by projecting it through lenses that stretch the image in the opposite direction, making it look normal. This way you can get an aspect ratio that is wider than a regular 35mm image without having to crop anything out.
"I drink your milkshake."
Robert Elswit said, "Paul knew he wanted to make an anamorphic film because he prefers the anamorphic lens system to shooting Super 35mm and doing an anamorphic release print. We did Hard 8 and Super 35, but every movie we've done since has been anamorphic. He just likes the look those lenses produce." When you shoot an anamorphic, there's a different feeling, a different way of staging, and a different depth of field. Paul loves older films, and those qualities mean something to him. High-speed lenses are lenses that can also film in low-light situations, or possibly in shady areas without needing to add light. They also shot using only prime lenses, which are lenses that cannot zoom in or out. Elswit said, "When I shot Good Night and Good Luck, we had a short schedule that required us to work fast, and we never took the 11:1 zoom off the camera. This show was different because Paul really likes the discipline of the 40mm, the 50mm, the 75mm, and the 100mm. He wants to make the movie play out in those sizes, and he understands how that affects staging and design." Elswit used modified C-series anamorphic lenses made by a lens designer named Dan Sasaki for Steven Soderbergh's Solaris. They also used, quote, a full set of E-series lenses, 2 modified spherical Panavision SP lenses, a 35mm and 55mm whose optics were roughly 40 years old, and a set of super high-speed lenses ranging from 35mm to 85mm whose optics were based on modifications Sasaki had made to another set for Memoirs of a Geisha. For the C-series and E-series lenses, Sasaki replaced the glass with more modern glass and made them flatter. In some cases, he removed the anti-reflective coatings from the lenses to allow for some lens flares. Sasaki said, "Paul didn't want the flares to look like the kind you might see in a music video. He wanted the controlled, organic look that you get from a dated lens."
Because the layout of the E-series has more lens shapes in it, we're going to see multiple staggered flares, unlike the single flare that we saw with the C-series. But because we have a better coating in the E-series, we're going to get a more controlled veiling glare, or our black's going to stay black longer.
They had some experience intentionally making lens flares for Paul Thomas Anderson's Punch Drunk Love, made around 5 years before There Will Be Blood. In an interview, Elswit talked about staging lens flares.
Those lens flares that you have in Punch Drunk Love.
Yeah, well, that's
right off.
That's
the
really
frame,
Paul. It's
throughout
Paul
the whole
going,
movie.
yeah. I mean, I gotta love those. You know, the anamorphic lens flare and how to get them to happen on cue, and it means we put Joker parts, which were they're little HMI lights, on C-stand arms, just out of camera, just out of the view of the camera.
Yeah,
and they'd uncover them at certain times and cover them up.
Paul Thomas Anderson had bought a vintage 1910 Pathé camera for specific scenes in Magnolia, and Sasaki, quote, tricked up a vintage 43mm lens that was built around the camera's optical element. Elswit notes that they used this for 6 or 8 shots in the film. One shot with the vintage lens that he was very pleased with was this shot of Plainview with an infant HW on the train. He says that if you look closely, you can see color shifts in the corners, where the colors don't line up precisely. Sasaki said that Anderson and Elswit did some of the most extensive testing he has ever seen to nail in a look with the lenses. A lot of movies nowadays look almost too perfect, almost like a commercial. It's very interesting to see the imperfections of the equipment adding to the overall feel of the story. Another good example, albeit a little more on the extreme side, is the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. Another characteristic of this lens is that it's very low contrast and tends to vignette optically, especially on a full negative. They used the C-series lenses mainly for interior scenes that didn't require high-speed lenses, and the E-series lenses for exteriors because those lenses had lower contrast and resolution than the standard E's. The E-series lenses would, quote, soften the harsh desert daylight a bit compared to the modified C lenses. The super high-speed lenses were used for night scenes as well as some scenes that took place at dusk. Elswit's first assistant cameraman said that, quote, the 43mm lens definitely had a vintage look, desaturated, low contrast, vignetting, and low resolution. What film stock to use on There Will Be Blood was also an important decision to make, especially for Paul Thomas Anderson, who doesn't tend to manipulate images in post-production. When it comes to film stocks, Anderson usually goes for the slowest film stocks possible. The slower the film stock, the less sensitive it is to light. So on one hand, you get a much clearer image with less grain, but on the other, you need a lot of light or a super fast lens in order to get an image. They shot the film on Kodak Vision 2 50D 5201 film for daylight scenes. 50D refers to the ISO or ASA being 50, and D refers to the color being balanced for daylight shooting. This means that the darker the location that you're filming, the bluer or cooler the image will be. For night scenes, they used Vision 2 200T 5217 film. The 200 refers to an ISO or ASA of 200, which is still pretty low. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this stuff, but I often screw around with film cameras, and an ISO of 200 will give you a whole lot of nothing indoors or at night, unless you can get a decent amount of light. The T refers to the color being balanced to tungsten light instead of daylight. Tungsten is more of a bluish or a cool light, so if you use non-tungsten lights on tungsten balanced film, you'll get a more orange or warm color. As I said, I don't know a ton about this stuff, but definitely check out the comments below because super knowledgeable people will often write comments with a ton of useful information. Paul Thomas Anderson has a reputation as a film purist. He doesn't usually allow filters to be used on his lenses. Elswit said, "We shot with Vision 2 stocks because they are less contrasty and easier to work with outdoors than Vision stocks. We did nothing fancy, no flashing, no special filters." Paul actually thinks that using an 85 filter is bad. I've often explained to him that the stocks are designed to work with an 85, but he thinks that's somehow interfering with the alchemy of Kodak. This time though, he let me use an 85 when it was appropriate. Deluxe Laboratories handled the daily previews of the raw footage they had shot the previous day. They printed all of their dailies. There were no DVDs or digital versions of the raw footage. Everything was a photochemical process. Nothing was digital except for a couple of shots where computer-generated effects were used. Sounds weird to think of PTA using CG for his movies. Well, here's an example. Those various oil wells were computer-generated. There was also the occasional removal of some modern parts of landscapes that didn't exist during the early 1900s.
I tried to show him some digital fixes on something, and he just said, "No, I don't want to do it." So we're not doing that. And okay. So we just finished it photochemically. There's no sleight of hand, and there's a few visual effects, adding oil wells and stuff like that.
Elswit noted that on other films that he has worked on that have used a digital intermediate, where they digitized the film in order to manipulate the color and other aspects of the image, he was usually able to cheat a bit during production because he knew that he could get the image he wanted by messing with it in post-production. This was not the case for There Will Be Blood or any of Anderson's films. Anderson said, "I'm either old-fashioned or quite stubborn or maybe both, but at the moment I don't really like digital intermediates. And I'm not sure what the advantage to the process is if you're shooting anamorphic. I have a hard enough time making up my mind about things without going into a DI suite. I don't think I'd ever get out of there. The process creates too many options, and at any rate, I don't like the way it looks." We live in a time in which filmmakers can pretty much make things look exactly the way they want it, whether that be changing the color like they did in Oh Brother Where Art Thou, or creating stylized space battles and computer-generated characters to better explore the vision of the artist. Stanley Kubrick said, "If it can be written or thought, it can be filmed." There is, however, something to be said about people like Paul Thomas Anderson who give up that control and allow the personality of the equipment or even the chemical reactions of the film to inform on the creation of the art piece. This is not to say that PTA is staying away from digital for the sake of capturing realism. After all, this is a period movie with lots of thought put into the production design, costumes, and lighting. That said, in the case of a movie like There Will Be Blood, this lack of control over the chemical process can create images that you could consider to be divine. The chemical reaction that creates these images has a certain input on how we receive the film. I feel like I used to be a film purist, but I don't think I really have a problem with control. I just have a problem when the special effects aren't good enough for me to give up my own reality and accept what is happening in the movie as real and not the product of the making of that movie. Of course, this is hard to do, and it's much more difficult to get an audience to accept Gollum as real than some oil wells that aren't actually there. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for part 2, where we will discuss how they shot down a mine shaft, how they achieved the naturalistic lighting style, and how they made an epic on a budget. CinemaTyler is made possible by my patrons over on Patreon. If you support the channel for as little as $1, you can get early access to videos, exclusive freebies, and you can suggest and vote on topics for videos like this one. Check it out. Thanks again for watching.